Hello guys! Welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here, and after many requests, today I finally paint a mecha. In the last few years, my artistic exploration was all about the human, or better, the anthropomorphic figure. But as you can tell from my nickname, that was also the title of my very first modeling blog, there was a time where robots, mechs and tanks were my only obsession. Coming from miniatures, complex sets and large scales can be intimidating, but there is a variety of little but still extremely detailed and fun kits that can easily introduce you to this corner of the modeling universe without breaking the bank or disrupting your painting schedule. So even if I'm committed to figures and miniatures, every now and then I still really enjoy the work on contained, power armor style mech suits, with obviously my hybrid take on the subject, that as always mixes and matches different sensibilities, styles and techniques. This kit comes from the YouTube anime series Obsolete, where humanity makes first contact with an alien race that offers a single, straightforward trading deal. In exchange for 1 ton of cheap limestone, you immediately get a mech that you can easily control with your mind. And because of the extremely profitable agreement, these machines quickly spread into almost every aspect of our civilization. This technology and its military application in particular is quite recent in the lore, so I tried to capture the feel of an armor relatively new to active duty, but still with the look of a crude and realistic factory paint job that shows the first stress and weathering of the field. That's also perfect to introduce a few basic techniques of the tank modeling world that you can easily transfer to any kind of vehicle and armor, like Space Marines for example. Don't forget to drop a like to help the diffusion of this video and the channel, and of course subscribe to join my painting journey in every corner of the hobby. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page, where you can find articles, extra material and the real-time footage of my videos, with every single little line and brushstroke. Thanks a million guys! Building, customizing and adding extra details to these models is kind of a hobby inside the hobby, and you can end up into new, extremely deep rabbit holes, each one with its own specific tools and techniques. Adding panel lines in particular is an incredible mix of designer sensibility and artisanal ability with chisels and scribers. But I want to keep the video focused on painting, so I keep all these ideas for a well-deserved, dedicated video. All this to say that I'm testing the water to see if there is interest for these topics that still didn't fully reach the miniature and wargaming world. So be vocal and let me know in the comments if you want to explore more of this niche stuff. I hate sanding. Especially working on sharp, precise, flat panels. So even if I want to keep things simple and accessible, I allowed myself to use the power sander with the 600 grit sandpaper to remove mold lines and artifacts from the sprues. It feels a bit like cheating, but the satisfaction greatly surpasses the shame. The fine but not too fine grit of the sandpaper fixes the imperfections, and at the same time makes the surface a bit easier for the paint to grab with a solid strength. Ooh, and I forgot to show you my new favorite tool, the Mini Desktop Vacuum Cleaner. You know that I never say something like this, but this incredible tool should be on the table of every modeler. With one of the pilots in place, you can better understand the scale of the figure. The final size is based on a 54mm human that sits like a baby on the back of the exoframe, looking over its shoulders. So the final height is quite contained, and all the extra volume is just thick armor protecting the military operator. With all the parts cleaned and the major connected blocks glued together, I can make a quick test fit to check the remaining relations. These kits are masterfully designed, taking in serious consideration the painting stage, often much more carefully than in actual display models and gaming miniatures. So there is always a way to separate the major elements and get access to the different levels of depth and critical angles for a comfortable handling of the parts in every stage of the work. The quote-unquote downside is that, at least in the initial stages, you have to work on every single element like an independent model. So I suggest you to invest into a good collection of cheap alligator clips. Or as an alternative, simple skewers and blue tack that you'll keep using anyway for parts without an easy hidden grab. I like to keep the pieces well separated, so they can dry without the risk of touching. Most of the time I use a simple piece of polystyrene as base, so I can place even the largest and strangest shapes and volumes, how and where I need them. I know that many of you think about this kind of modeling as completely different from our usual, and I'm aware that the process so far leans into this direction. But when it comes to painting, I don't change paints or tools, and I work with the same brands I use for miniatures and figures. What really changes is the order of my steps, aimed to put a stronger accent on the local visual information of the armor plates. I prime the frame in satin black to support the next true metallic layer. If you want to paint realistic, shiny metallic silver, the basic one-for-all Molotov silver is not a great option. But here I want to render a bit of the alien nature of the metallic frame, visually in contrast with all the other materials. So its smooth and uniform, almost non-metallic finish is perfect for the effect I have in mind. And I prime the hull with a matte dark violet. So here is where I start taking a bit the distance from the more classic Gunpla painting. Yeah, from the primer. I don't like to handle these kits as endlessly movable action figures, because to get that universal posability, you have to renounce to theatrical, strong, and therefore binding lights and shadows, and their interesting modeling of the volumes. And I always prefer to have a piece grounded in a precise environment, and to a cinematic, dramatic shot. Here I'm going for an analogous general scheme, all based on warm tones, and violet is a great foundation to introduce that general warmth into the deepest angles and under the foundations of the local tones. With the base of my environmental shadows in place, I set the base of the local tone of the armor. And a simple, subtle, opaque zenithal modulation into the lights. In the final picture, this will be a rendering of the medium lights of the volumes, and at the same time, one of the micro layers of paint over the hull. You'll see better what I mean later. At this point I can remove the parts from the clips and rebuild the inner frame. I use a fluorescent blue ink to introduce more sci-fi reflections to the metal. I start shooting frontally, and I spray heavier layers from below, leaving the original silver on top as a highlight. Again, this step is meant to set the local color of this material, and later I'll work on top of it to add the environmental information. Same deal with the armor. That, keeping the instructions on the side, I fix in place using just the tight pressure fits of the kit, made tighter and even more solid by the layers of paint. And here is the natural extreme consequence of my painting preferences. I play a bit with the model to find a pose that I like. I fix it to a base or a display plinth with a couple of solid pins. And I use a super thin, quick-acting plastic glue to block the joints in this position. Again, this is a subjective idiosyncrasy that comes from my interests as a painter, and the fact that I never really change the pose of my kits when they land on the shelf. So I personally don't have anything to lose with this choice. I can also quickly add a few details to the base to work every part as a proper whole in the next stages. That's really important to get the right general mood and the flow of lights and shadows. The best way to add micro-visual interest to open, simple surfaces without many sculpted details is always a fine rendering of textures and the almost tactile depth of the material we are painting. And if you are working with just flat armor plates and nothing else, you really have to push that information to the extreme. I apply 2 light coats of Worn Effects fluid. That's basically just a less aggressive chipping medium, for more subtle effects or simply smaller scales. And I loosely layer a light, warm off-white over every panel. Lighter, but both for value and tone not too different from the previous layer, because what I'm trying to produce here is not a deep chipping effect, but more the light, random abrasion of the most external layer of paint. I let it set in the short time I need to prime the base. And with a bit of tap water and different old soft brushes, I activate the chipping fluid that loosens in a controllable but still quite random way parts of the last layer. The visual jump is subtle, and it will become even more subtle and fused with the surface in the next stages. And that's totally fine, because it represents just the light deterioration of the external coat of paint, exposed to light and to a soft environmental impact. I apply a coat of satin varnish to fix in place this situation and to create the perfect base to apply the decals. This is the best stage to apply decals, or freehand markings and symbols, because they are realistically applied over the factory paint job, and its intrinsic local tone and tactile imperfections. And later, they are realistically exposed to weathering agents that happen on top of everything. Basically, the chronology of events happening on the metal plates of the armor should be the map for the stages of your work. I'm still in the early stages, but I move immediately to oils, because here local effects have the priority, and this is the natural order in which they happen. With a dark mix of black and brown, plus a pinch of magenta to keep pushing on the warmth of the scene, I create a dense but flowing wash that I apply in a very precise way to visually separate all the little elements and panel lines. The flow is also helped by the satin varnish used to set the decals. This step covers a lot of functions at the same time. The lining around the details is in part the natural, sharp shadow created by two geometric elements in close contact, like the black line you see around the doors of a car, for example. But it's also the weathering and dirt accumulated around those hard-edged shapes. And all this creates the sharp, dark definition of the model. Since I'm looking for a more realistic look, I don't use Q-tips to clean and refine my lines, because they tend to leave more paint around the volumes, producing thicker and more cartoony lines. A fine brush moistened in white spirit can better fade the borders into a soft, realistic spread of light/dirt, leaving only super sharp marks around the details. I've worked on this step at the end of the painting day, so I can leave the paint to dry overnight and start in the morning with a new oil layer. I don't use varnish because all these weathering effects work also on their physical overlap and the visual depth it produces that varnish completely levels and kills. Time to break even more the unrealistic monotony of this paint job, with extra random but soft and subtle environmental effects. I use white, plus 4 warm colors that, except for white, are all transparent, for a softer and more delicate impact. Yellow is here because of the yellowish local tone of the armor. The reds come from the virtual environmental warmth and the bouncing light from the red sand of the base. And green is there as bouncing light from the metallic alien frame, and for a general disruption, without going too much into cold shades. Working in small sections, I apply random dots of these tones, using a higher concentration of the darker ones into the shadows, and the lighter ones on the parts more exposed to light. And following the vectors of gravity, I blend the dots with a big flat brush moistened in white spirit and gentle vertical brushstrokes. You can repeat this process over and over until you are satisfied with the result. You have to be careful using powerful opaque tones like white, but here I want to bring in a bit of its chalkiness to sell the idea of a light, sticky dust, so I use a bit more than my usual for this process. After 3 or 4 of these passes, the model needs a good 24 hours of rest, but for you, it will take only a second. Time for another of my very personal takes on the subject. Use this idea knowing that you'll probably piss off both purist Gunpla modelers and purist tank modelers. My visual vocabulary comes from movies, video games, and fantasy illustrations, and I cannot give up on theatrical contrast and environmental light. So, continuing to follow that idea of the chronological layering of events, I paint the environmental light cast over the local intrinsic elements, with a progression of warm, transparent, darker and darker tones that heavily shape and finally render the volumes of the figure. I've added a few drops of matte medium inside every load of ink to match the matte finish of everything else. The light setting is of course super dramatic and over the top, but I still get the very realistic beat of having shadows that actively swallow the finer details into their increasing overlapped opacity, creating extra depth, inside of which you really lose visual information, like in the real world. Time for light definition. That in this situation, instead of being a stylized edge highlight, comes from painting the chipping of the sharp edges that really expose the lighter, cleaner tones of the paint polished by friction. This is another big lost in translation between modeling communities. Miniature painters think they are painting edge highlights, so light as in a beam of photons. And tank modelers face the problem as light superficial chipping. Different mindset, different objectives, but a similar practical approach and results. Truth is that working on sharp metallic shapes, you are probably doing both at the same time. And that's why here I'm breaking my chronological progression of events. Sure, I want to paint the damaged paint around the edges, but using only this point of view, that information should have been swallowed by the shadows. Adding the idea that's also an actual sharp edge catching light, I can paint also the highlights of the shadow areas, boosting the definition even more. Sure, I need extra work, and even if it starts from few main tones, I need a full, complex progression of shades to adapt to each area. But this way I get the best of both philosophies, and I kill two birds with one stone. Chippings are their own huge chapter, but here is one of the best tips for realistic damaged paint. When two lines meet, don't paint just their sharp edges converging, but extend the chipped area in the middle. That's always an extremely weak point for paint and an easy target for hits and friction. So you can't go wrong enlarging the area of scratches into a softer, larger curve. And if you still feel the need for extra noise and microscopic scratches, you can use the sponge technique, both with dark and light tones. Or oil paint, projecting micro droplets of paint with the sling effect of a toothpick. The advantage of this approach is that you can easily erase the scratches you don't like with a tiny bit of white spirit. And here is the final result. I know, like Balto the dog, I belong neither to Gampla or tank modeling. I'm very passionate about both, and they are both a big part of my formation as jack of all trades painter. But the extreme grade of specialization they require often creates a limited visual field on the more general and holistic take on painting that I like. And I'm really glad that thanks to the huge variety of subjects we have in miniature painting and wargaming, we are able to constantly explore and apply stuff coming literally from everywhere. To the point where you can even study Barbie dolls to understand simplified makeup styles. Yeah, that is a thing. To summarize, techniques are just the notes, not the melody. And your work as painters is to find new arrangements for those basic elements. Wait, that's a musician. Okay, I may have lost the thread of my own metaphor, but you understood what I mean. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!